The air in the master's suite of Vance Manor was not just cold, it was heavy, thick. It clung to the lungs, a putrid sweetness that choked the throat. This was what Martha, the head housekeeper, noticed first. It was a smell that should not be, a horrifying miasma that had, for weeks, been disguised by lavender, by burnt rosemary, and by the sheer, terrifying denial of the staff. But on this morning in the late fall of 1861, the odor had finally overpowered all else. It was the undeniable stench of corruption. Martha's hand, trembling, pushed the heavy oak door open. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight against the Tennessee sunlight. In the corner, a rocking chair creaked, a slow, rhythmic complaint. Eliza Vance, the bride, was sitting there, her porcelain features illuminated by a single, guttering candle. She was humming a wedding tune, and her eyes were fixed on the grand, four-poster bed. "He's just sleeping, Martha," she whispered, her voice a dry rattle. "Julian is just resting." But Martha's gaze, drawn by a horrifying, irresistible gravity, settled on the bed, on the shape beneath the quilt. It was still, far too still. And it was wrong. This was not sleep. This was something else, something that had been left to fester in the dark. This was not a sick room. This was a tomb. Martha's scream was a choked, guttural sound that died in her throat. Her mind simply refused to process the tableau of horror before her. Eliza, the young bride, barely 20 years old, looked like a forgotten porcelain doll, her wedding dress, or one much like it, still on her frame, though now soiled and gray. She rocked and she hummed, her focus entirely on the bed, the thing in the bed. It was a grotesque mockery of a man. The servants had whispered for months. They had known. They had felt the wrongness that had settled over Vance Manor like a shroud. But this was a confirmation of a reality far more macabre than any of them had dared to imagine. This was not grief-stricken madness. This was a forbidden ritual. This was a secret kept in decaying flesh. We are in the mountains of East Tennessee in the year 1861. The world outside the manor's gates is descending into the chaos of the Civil War. Tennessee itself is a fractured, bleeding state, tearing itself apart over loyalty and secession. But the war, with all its distant cannon fire and political furor, was a pale terror compared to the intimate, horrifying secret being kept by a young bride in the suffocating darkness of the master's suite. This was not a story of war. This was the story of a love that refused to accept death, and in its refusal became something monstrous. To understand the horror, one must first understand the hope that preceded it. Eliza Hayes was, by all accounts, the jewel of Knoxville society in 1860. She was lauded for her pale beauty, her delicate constitution, and her skill at the pianoforte. But those who knew her well spoke of a sensitivity, a fragility, a mind that felt things too deeply. She was prone to bouts of profound melancholy, romantic flights of fancy that bordered on the obsessive. Her world was one of dark poetry and tragic romances. Then came Julian Vance. He was older, wealthier, and possessed an intensity that many found unsettling. He was a man of old-world sensibilities, the sole heir to the isolated Vance fortune and the sprawling, shadow-filled manor that bore his name. The Vance family was rumored to be eccentric, reclusive, and some whispered cursed. But Julian, with his dark eyes and charismatic gravity, saw Eliza and wanted her. Their courtship was a whirlwind, an intense, possessive affair that culminated in a hasty wedding in the spring of 1861, just as the first shots of the war echoed from Fort Sumter. It was a marriage born of passion, but overshadowed by the looming national catastrophe and the strange, brooding isolation of Vance Manor. Vance Manor was not a home, it was a fortress of solitude. Built by Julian's grandfather in the remote, thickly forested hills, it was miles from any real civilization. The architecture was severe, almost Gothic, a stone edifice that seemed to rise from the earth like a natural, brooding feature. The few servants who worked there were bound to the Vances by generations of service and by fear. They spoke in whispers of the Vance curse, a local legend that the family's blood was tainted, that they loved too fiercely, and that their grief often took dark, forbidden paths. Julian Vance, now in his late 30s, was the embodiment of this legacy. He was controlling, his love for Eliza a suffocating, possessive thing. He reveled in their isolation, encouraging Eliza to sever ties with her family in Knoxville. He wanted her to be his world and for him to be her only reality. As the spring of 1861 turned to a hot, tense summer, the manor became Eliza's entire universe. The war raged, but for her, the only reality was the oppressive, all-consuming devotion of her new husband, a devotion that was beginning to feel less like a romance and more like a cage. The first few months of the marriage were, by Eliza's own account in her diary, an intense fever. Julian doted on her, but his doting was a form of surveillance. He allowed no visitors. He monitored her letters. He cultivated her dependence, preying on her sensitive nature. Eliza, in turn, developed an obsessive attachment. She saw his control as protection, his possessiveness as passion. She was living the very kind of dark, all-consuming romance she had read about. But the outside world could not be kept at bay forever. By July 1861, Tennessee had officially seceded, and the war was no longer a distant rumor. Confederate recruitment officers came calling even to remote estates like Vance Manor. Julian, however, was enigmatic about his loyalties. He was not a political man, he was a Vance. His only loyalty was to his land, his legacy, and his bride. But the pressure was mounting. Men were choosing sides. And Julian, it seemed, had business to attend to. Business that, for the first time since their wedding, would require him to leave his young, fragile bride alone in the looming stone fortress. This separation, this first crack in their perfect, isolated world, would prove to be the catalyst for the entire horrifying affair. In early August, Julian announced his departure. He was cryptic, speaking only of family interests in Nashville that required his immediate personal attention. He dismissed Eliza's panicked, tearful protests with a cold finality. He would be gone 2 weeks, no more. He instructed the servants to obey her, but also to watch her. His parting words to Eliza, overheard by Martha, were chilling. "You are a Vance now, my dear. Do not forget what that means. Do not let me down." Eliza locked herself in her room for 3 days after he rode away. When she emerged, she was changed. The fragile girl was gone, replaced by a cold, severe woman who mirrored her husband's intensity. She stalked the halls of the manor, her grip on the servants tightening. She seemed to be in a state of suspended animation, waiting. The 2 weeks passed. Then a third. Julian did not return. The war and the breakdown of communication made his absence plausible. But as the third week bled into a fourth, Eliza's cold composure began to crack, revealing the raw, obsessive panic beneath. She would spend hours staring down the long, winding drive, waiting. And the house waited with her. It was near the end of September when he finally returned. A lone rider, not the proud patriarch who had left, but a slumped figure on a weary horse. Julian Vance was sick. He was burning with a fever, his mind delirious. The servants carried him to the master's suite. A doctor was summoned from the nearest town, a day's ride away. The diagnosis was grim. A camp fever, likely typhoid, contracted in the squalid, war-torn streets of Nashville. The doctor left powders and instructions, but his expression offered little hope. He warned Eliza to keep her distance to avoid the contagion. Eliza, however, did the opposite. She barricaded herself in the room. She dismissed Martha and the other servants. She alone would nurse her husband. She alone would be the one to save him. For 3 days and 3 nights, the only sounds from the room were the ravings of a delirious man and the constant, soothing whispers of his bride. The servants would leave trays of food and water by the door. They would be taken, but Eliza was never seen. She had become a ghost, a guardian at the gates of her husband's life. On the 4th day, a horrifying silence fell. The feverish raving stopped. The whispering stopped. Martha, her heart pounding with a cold dread, knocked on the door. After a long, agonizing pause, Eliza's voice, hollow and strange, came from within. "He is resting. The fever has broken. You are forbidden to enter. We must not be disturbed." The relief among the staff was palpable, but it was short-lived. The order was absolute. The master's suite was now a sealed chamber. Days turned into a week. Eliza would open the door just a crack to retrieve the food trays, her face always obscured by the darkness of the room. She communicated in written notes slipped under the door. "Mr. Vance is weak but recovering. He requires absolute silence." But the servants knew the patterns of sickness. They knew the rhythms of recovery, and this was wrong. There was no sound, no movement. And then, faintly at first, came the smell. It was subtle, a strange, chemical, and faintly sweet odor, not unlike the preserving rooms of a mortuary. It was a smell that sparked a dark, forbidden thought in Martha's mind. What was happening in that room? The lie was maintained for an astonishing, horrifying length of time. We are now in October 1861. The glorious Appalachian autumn is painting the hills in fire, but Vance Manor is a place of cold, gray stone and creeping dread. The lie of Julian's recovery became the new reality. Eliza, now a gaunt and spectral figure, would occasionally be seen walking the upper hallway at night, a candle in her hand, but she never spoke. The servants, isolated by the war, terrified of their mistress, and bound by a generation of loyalty, became complicit in the secret. They scrubbed the hallway floors with vinegar and lye, attempting to mask the odor that was now beginning to seep from beneath the sealed door. They whispered among themselves. They spoke of the Vance curse. They remembered stories of Julian's great-grandmother, a woman who, legend said, had kept her stillborn child in a cradle for a full winter. They were trapped in a house of madness. The recovery of Julian Vance had become a macabre performance, and the entire household were its unwilling audience. How long, they whispered, could this go on? How long before the horrifying truth clawed its way out? The mind can build powerful defenses against a truth it cannot bear. For Eliza Vance, that defense was a complete immersive delusion. We know from the fragments of her diary found later that her mind had fractured. She did not register Julian's death. She recorded the moment his fever broke, the moment his body went still, not as an end, but as a transition. He had entered, in her words, the great slumber. He was not dead. He was simply shedding his mortal sickness. Her new sacred duty was to guide him through this long, quiet passage. Her nursing did not stop, it changed. It became a ritual of preservation. The chemical smell the servants had noted was real. Eliza, it seems, had used her husband's library. She had found books, old, possibly forbidden texts on anatomy and, more chillingly, primitive methods of embalming. She had access to arsenic, used for pest control on the estate. She had access to whiskey, salts, and oils. She had begun a grotesque, desperate, and horrifyingly intimate process of trying to stop time. She was fighting a war against the natural laws of decay, armed with a fractured mind and a chilling, possessive love. Inside that sealed room, a parallel reality was being enacted. Eliza went about a daily routine. She would wake, greet her husband, and read to him from her books of poetry. She would bathe his cooling, stiffening body. She would speak to him for hours, her one-sided conversations a catalogue of their brief, intense life together, her plans for their future, her anger at the outside world that had tried to take him. She was, in her mind, the perfect, devoted wife. But the physical reality of what she was doing was a nightmare. The body of Julian Vance was not resting. It was succumbing to the inevitable, horrifying process of decomposition. Her crude, desperate attempts at preservation were only a partial success. They slowed the process, but they also changed it. They created a grotesque artifact, a mummified, chemical-laden horror that bore only a passing resemblance to the man she had married. She slept beside this thing every night. She held its hand. She hummed it to sleep. The macabre nature of her vigil was lost on her. She was simply in love, and her love was stronger than death. The psychological term for this is a mummification delusion, a profound psychotic break where grief manifests as a total denial of loss, leading the survivor to preserve the body of the deceased. But in 1861, there was no such diagnosis. There was only madness. And in the isolated hills of Tennessee, there was also the curse. The servants were convinced. They were living in a haunted house, their mistress a high priestess in a macabre ritual. Martha, the housekeeper, was the one suffering the most. She was the de facto head of the household, and she was enabling this abomination. She tried to intervene. She knocked on the door, pleading with Eliza to let a doctor in just to check on Mr. Julian's progress. Eliza's response, slipped under the door, was chilling. "Mr. Vance is my concern. Your loyalty is to me. Speak of this to no one, or you will answer to him when he wakes." The threat, so clearly delusional, was also terrifyingly real. They were cut off. The war had made the roads unsafe. The Vance name held power. They had no one to turn to. They were prisoners of this horrifying, rotting secret. We are now in November. Nearly 2 months have passed since Julian Vance drew his last breath. 2 months of this horrifying, secret vigil. The temperature in the mountains has dropped. The cold air helped Eliza's grotesque project, further slowing the inevitable, but nothing could stop it completely. The smell was now a permanent, unavoidable resident of the manor. It was a thick, gagging sweetness that permeated the stone walls, the heavy drapes, the very wood of the floors. The servants confined themselves to the kitchens and the lower floors. The entire upper wing of the manor was abandoned, ceded to Eliz. And the thing she kept in her bed. The lie had become an unspoken, horrifying truth. Julian Vance was dead. His bride was insane. And they were all, every last one, trapped. The breaking point was coming. It had to. The physical reality of the situation was becoming untenable. The secret was literally rotting its way through the floorboards, demanding to be exposed. The only question was who would be the one to finally, terrifyingly, open that forbidden door. The end of the secret did not come from within. It came, as it so often does, from the outside world. Julian Vance had an estranged brother, Marcus Vance, a pragmatic, humorless businessman living in Union-controlled Louisville. The brothers had not spoken in years, a feud over the family inheritance. But Marcus, despite the war, kept tabs. He had heard of Julian's sickness through scattered, delayed letters. When all communication from Vance Manor ceased, his suspicion, not his concern, was piqued. He feared Julian had died, and that his new young wife was taking control of the estate. With the war making travel a nightmare, it took him weeks to secure passage, to bribe his way through military checkpoints, and to make the treacherous journey south into the heart of rebellious Tennessee. He arrived at Vance Manor on a cold, gray afternoon in mid-November, unannounced. He was not prepared for what he would find. He was not prepared for the House of Silence, the terrified servants, or the god-awful, horrifying smell. Marcus Vance was a man of cold logic. He did not believe in curses. He believed in incompetence, and he believed in deceit. When he was met at the door by a trembling Martha, his questions were sharp and accusatory. Where was his brother? Why had his letters gone unanswered? Martha, trapped between her terrified loyalty and this new, aggressive authority, finally broke. In a torrent of whispered, hysterical words, she confessed. Mr. Julian had been sick. He was recovering. He was in his room. He had been recovering for 2 months. He must not be disturbed. Marcus's face darkened. He didn't need to hear about curses. He just followed the smell. It led him up the grand staircase, down the shadowed upper hall to the sealed door of the master suite. It was an odor of such profound, gag-inducing horror that he had to cover his face with a handkerchief. He pounded on the door. "Eliza, this is Marcus Vance. Open this door. Open it now, or I will break it down." From within there was only silence, and then, faintly, the sound of that slow, rhythmic rocking. The door was thick oak, but Marcus was a strong man fueled by a cold rage. He put his shoulder to it once, twice, and on the third impact the lock splintered and the door flew open. We are now back where we began, but this time we are seeing it through the unfiltered, horrified eyes of Marcus Vance. The room was almost lightless. The air was so thick, so putrid, that he gagged, stumbling back into the hallway, his stomach heaving. It was the smell of a slaughterhouse, of a charnel pit, mixed with the sickeningly sweet scents of lavender and arsenic. He lit a lamp from the hallway and stepped inside. The scene was a tableau from a madman's nightmare. Eliza was in the rocking chair, her hair matted, her eyes wide and luminous in the lamplight. She was skeletal, and on the bed lay the thing. It was a grotesque, shrunken, leathery artifact, a blackened, distorted shape that was barely recognizable as human. It was covered in a fine layer of salt and powder, and it was dressed in Julian's finest silk nightshirt. Eliza smiled, a cracked, horrifying gesture. "You've come to see him, Marcus. He's been waiting, but you must be quiet. He is in his great slumber." Marcus Vance, a man who had seen the grim realities of business and the beginnings of a bloody war, was frozen by a horror so profound it defied reason. His mind simply could not accept the intimacy of the scene. Eliza, this young, porcelain woman, had been living like this. She had been sleeping, eating, and existing in this tomb beside this corruption. He saw the books on the nightstand. He saw the bowls of powders and oils. He saw the soiled linens. He realized with a wave of nauseating clarity the sheer, staggering extent of her madness. This was not a secret kept for a day or a week. This was a long, sustained, ritualistic dedication to a horrifying lie. He lunged for the window, tearing the heavy curtains from their rods, breaking the glass to let the cold, clean November air into the putrid room. The sudden light was brutal. It illuminated the full, grotesque reality of Julian Vance's corpse. It was a thing of nightmares. And in that light, Eliza screamed. It was not a scream of fear, but of pure, incandescent rage. "You've woken him, you've ruined it." She attacked him. The skeletal, fragile girl moved with a feral, shocking strength. She was a cornered animal defending her lair. She raked her nail across his face, biting, shrieking, her voice a horrifying, inhuman sound. It took Marcus and two of the male servants who had been drawn by the commotion to subdue her. They had to physically drag her from the room, her eyes locked on the bed, her hands reaching back toward the monstrous thing she called her husband. "He is mine," she wailed. "He promised. He will never leave me." They locked her in a guest room where she immediately began to smash the furniture, her screams and sobs echoing through the manor, a soundtrack to the horrifying discovery. Marcus, his face bleeding, his suit stained with the filth of the room, was left to confront the reality his brother had become. The servants, weeping in a mixture of terror and relief, refused to enter the master suite. The curse, they said, had been exposed. The forbidden act had been brought into the light, and now they would all be damned. The task of liberating Julian Vance's remains fell to Marcus. It was a horrifying, gag-inducing ordeal that required a strong stomach and bottle of whiskey. The body, such as it was, had been crudely preserved. It was a macabre testament to Eliza's desperate, twisted devotion. Marcus, however, was a pragmatist. His grief, if any, was eclipsed by his fury and his financial concerns. He had the thing wrapped in oilcloths and taken from the room. A simple pine box was constructed. There would be no funeral. There would be no ceremony. Under the cover of darkness, the servants were ordered to bury the box in an unmarked corner of the family cemetery on the property. It was a grim, hurried affair, lit only by torches. The manor was being cleansed of its secret. As the last shovelful of dirt was thrown, a piercing, animalistic wail cut through the night. It was Eliza from her locked room, howling her grief and rage into the void. She knew. Somehow, she knew her groom had been taken from her, this time for good. With the source of the horror buried, Marcus Vance turned his attention to two things: his inheritance and the problem of Eliza. He found her diary, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the master suite. He had been looking for a will for bank documents. Instead, he found a map into the landscape of a shattered mind. The diary began with hope, with her obsessive love for Julian. It documented her fear of his departure, her panic during his absence. Then it recorded his return, his sickness, and her vow to never let him go. The entries following his death were the most disturbing. They were lucid, calm, and meticulous. She wrote of her experiments, her progress in halting the passage. She described the process of bathing, oiling, and feeding the corpse with preservatives. She saw herself as a scientist, a pioneer in a forbidden art. It was not the ranting of a lunatic. It was the precise, chilling, and utterly macabre chronicle of a woman who had, in the name of love, methodically created her own horrifying reality. The diary, however, contained one final, horrifying twist. It was a secret hidden within the secret. Marcus, reading by candlelight, his blood running cold, stumbled upon the entries from the days before Julian's fever. Eliza wrote of a terrible discovery. She had found letters from Julian to a woman in Nashville. His family business was a lie. He had not been securing his fortune, he had been securing his escape. The letters detailed his plan to liquidate assets, to abandon Vance Manor, and to start a new life with his mistress. He was not just leaving Eliza for 2 weeks, he was leaving her for good. He had planned to return only to inform her that their marriage, their fever dream, was over. But he never got the chance. Because in the very next entry Eliza wrote, "He says he has a chill. I have prepared him a tonic. The one my great-grandmother wrote of. It will calm his heart. It will fix his wandering." The camp fever was a lie. The sickness was not an accident. It was an administration. This was no longer a case of madness. This was a cold case. Julian Vance had not died of typhoid. He had been poisoned. Eliza, in her sensitivity, in her obsessive, fragile state, had been pushed from romantic obsession to cold, calculated murder. The tonic she mentioned was likely a slow-acting poison, perhaps arsenic, which she had in plentiful supply. She had caused the fever. She had created the delirium. Her nursing was a horrifying performance, a way to control his death, to be the only one he saw as he slipped away. She had not been trying to save him, she had been keeping him. His death was her ultimate act of possession. The macabre, months-long vigil in that room was not an act of grief-stricken madness, or at least not only that. It was an extension of her crime. It was her victory lap. She had promised he would never leave her. And she had kept her word in the most disturbing, horrifying way imaginable. The bride had not just slept beside her dead band, she had slept beside her victim. Marcus Vance was horrified, but he was also a pragmatist. He was a Vance. This secret, this crime, could not be allowed to stain the family name. The war provided the perfect cover. The world was chaotic, justice was fragmented. He made a decision. The diary, this single piece of evidence, was his to destroy. He dropped the leather-bound book into the fireplace, watching as the pages, filled with Eliza's spidery script, curled and blackened into ash. The only proof of the murder was gone. The cold case of Julian Vance was closed, moments after it had been opened. Eliza's crime was erased. All that was left was her madness, and that Marcus could deal with. He was not interested in justice. He was interested in containment. The Vance legacy and the Vance fortune would be secured. The dark, forbidden history of what truly happened in that room would be buried, along with Julian's grotesque remains. The truth, like the smell, would be scoured from the manor. The fate of Eliza Vance was swift and silent. Marcus had connections. He used the chaos of the war to his advantage. A carriage arrived in the dead of night. Eliza, now passive and empty, a hollowed-out shell of the woman she had been, was led from the house. She did not speak. She did not fight. Her diary was gone. Her husband was gone. Her entire macabre world had been dismantled. She was taken east to one of the few functioning asylums that still operated. The admission papers, signed by Marcus, listed her diagnosis simply as acute hysteria and melancholia, brought on by the grief of her husband's sudden death and the stresses of the war. There was no mention of poison. There was no mention of the horrifying 2-month vigil. The Vance name and a significant amount of gold ensured that her case was sealed, her history rewritten. She was, in effect, vanished. She entered the asylum and was never heard from again. She became another ghost, swallowed by the twin darknesses of madness and the Civil War. Marcus Vance did not stay at the manor. He loathed the place. He saw it as a monument to the family curse he had always despised. He locked the master's suite, leaving the stained bed, the rocking chair, and the ghostly imprint of the horror behind. He ordered the servants to maintain the house, but to never, under any circumstances, unlock that room. He returned to Louisville, the sole heir to the Vance fortune. The manor, with its horrifying secret, was left to rot. The servants, one by one, drifted away, unable to live with the memories, the whispers, the cold dread that now permanently inhabited the halls. They took with them the story, but it was a fragmented, superstitious tale. They spoke of the curse, of the bride who loved her husband so much she couldn't let him go. They spoke of the smell. They spoke of the madness. But none of them ever knew the truth. None of them knew that they had been living in the house of a murderer, not just a mad woman. The story of the bride of Vance Manor became a forbidden local legend, a ghost story told in hushed tones around fireplaces in the Appalachian Hills. It was a tale used to frighten children, a warning about the eccentric, dark-hearted Vances and the land they owned. The manor itself stood empty for years, a dark monolith on the hill. Locals avoided it. They claimed the land was soured, cursed. They said that on cold November nights, you could still see a single flickering candle in the window of the master suite, and that if the wind was right, you could hear a woman humming a wedding tune. The house became a physical scar on the landscape, a reminder of the dark, unsettling, and macabre history that the war had tried and failed to erase. It was a story that refused to stay buried, even after the truth of it had been burned to ash. What makes this story so uniquely horrifying? It is not just the act itself, as ghoulish as it is. It is the intimacy of the horror. It is the fusion of obsessive love and profound madness, of romantic delusion and cold, calculated crime. Eliza Vance was both a tragic, broken victim of her own mind and a terrifying, possessive predator. She inhabited a space between grief and monstrosity. The sealed room was her sanctuary, her masterpiece, and her prison. She did not just keep her husband's body, she curated it. She tended to it. She slept beside it. She blurred the line between life and death, love and abomination, until she had created a new, horrifying reality for herself. It is this dedication, this methodical, domestic, and sustained macabre ritual, that elevates this from a simple ghost story to one of the most disturbing, psychological cold cases in American history. The fate of Vance Manor provides a fitting final chapter to this disturbing tale. The house stood abandoned for over a decade after the war. No one, not even Marcus Vance, ever returned to claim it. It was a place of bad memories and dark legends. Then, in the winter of 1873, it burned. A fire started by vagrants or, as the locals insisted, by a supernatural hand, consumed the estate. It burned for 3 days, a furious cleansing inferno that reduced the dark stone walls to a pile of blackened rubble. The fire, it was said, finally released the spirits trapped within. The locked master suite, the stained bed, the rocking chair. All of it was consumed, incinerated, and returned to the earth. The physical evidence of Eliza's crime and her madness was gone. All that remained was the story. The historical record is, by design, almost silent. The asylum where Eliza was supposedly interred burned down in 1880, its records and the fates of its patients lost forever. Marcus Vance died a wealthy and respected, if cold, businessman, his family's dark secret taken to the grave. The servants' stories, passed down through generations, became diluted, transforming into the vague Vance curse legend. The truth of the matter, the poison, the letters, the murder, was successfully banned from history, erased by fire and by the deliberate, cold-blooded actions of Marcus Vance. All we are left with is the horrifying central image: a young bride in a lonely manor in the midst of a bloody war, refusing to let her husband go. An image of love so possessive, so twisted, that it defied sanity, nature, and death itself. This story serves as a chilling reminder of the darkness that can hide behind the curtains of polite society, and the way that isolation, personal, psychological, and geographical, can act as a hothouse for madness. Eliza Vance, a sensitive girl, was pushed by a perfect storm of an obsessive personality, a controlling husband, profound betrayal, and the chaos of the Civil War. She was cut off from all reality, and so she created her own. A reality where death was not an end but a slumber. A reality where her love was the only law, and poison was the only way to ensure her happily ever after. The Bride of Vance Manor is a true-life horror story, a deeply disturbing glimpse into a mind that fractured and, in its breaking, built a monument to a macabre and everlasting love. The questions that remain are almost as chilling as the facts. How much of her action was madness, and how much was cold, calculated malice? Did the madness come after the murder as a way to cope with her crime? Or was the murder itself the first, definitive act of a mind that had already broken? What was the tonic her great-grandmother wrote of? Was this a curse passed down through the female line, a forbidden, dark knowledge? Or was it simply a desperate woman using the tools available to her? The destruction of her diary means we will never know the true balance of her mind. The cold case of Julian Vance's murder will forever remain unsolved, his killer known only to the ghosts of that burned-down manor. This case is also a testament to the power of secrets, the secret of the poison, the secret of the body, the secret kept by the terrified servants, the secret buried by Marcus Vance. The entire affair was a conspiracy of silence, layered in fear, shame, and madness. The Civil War, raging just beyond the hills, was the perfect distraction. In a world where thousands were dying violent deaths every day, what was one more quiet, natural death in a remote manor house? Eliza's crime was shielded by a greater national tragedy. It allowed her the time, months, to enact her horrifying ritual, to live out her dark fantasy, undisturbed. She and her grotesque groom were safe in their little bubble of horror, while the nation outside tore itself apart. Today, nothing remains of Vance Manor but a few blackened foundation stones on a remote, overgrown hill. The land is private, and the locals still refuse to go near it. The story has faded from active memory, existing only in obscure historical footnotes and in the dark corners of Appalachian folklore. It has become one of those forbidden histories, a tale too disturbing to be told in the light of day. It is a story about the fragility of the human mind and the terrifying, limitless depths of human obsession. It challenges our understanding of grief, love, and the sacred boundary between life and death. For Eliza Vance, that boundary did not exist. There was only her vow and her refusal to be abandoned. If you want to hear more forbidden histories like this, the kind that have been deliberately buried, subscribe now, because the archives of the past are filled with stories too disturbing for the official record. The case of Eliza Vance is a perfect, horrifying example. It's a story where the lines between victim and villain, between a grieving bride and a calculating monster, are irrevocably blurred. She was both. Her love was real, but it was a toxic, consuming fire. Her madness was profound, but it was also a convenient shield for a horrifying crime. She was the architect of her own macabre fairy tale, a story that began with a wedding and ended in a rotting, poisoned tomb of her own making. In the end, we are left with the silence. The records are gone. The house is ash. The participants are all long dead. All that survives is the dark, chilling legend. The cold case of Julian Vance is sealed not by law but by time and by fire. The only thing we know for certain is that in 1861, as the country bled, a young bride in Tennessee murdered her husband. And then, for more than 2 months, in an act of possessive, all-consuming, and utterly macabre devotion, she refused to say goodbye. She kept him, she tended to him, and she slept soundly every single night beside the horrifying, decaying proof of her love.